Street bands are one of the musical wonders of the world. The sound of celebration from Brazil to New Orleans, the Balkans to Delhi. These bands play for processions and parades, for dances, rituals, weddings and funerals, civic and state occasions, dances and fairs. Street band music has vernacular roots. It is a people's music, a music often made by amateurs, but no less rich, vibrant and skilled because of that. It is the music of town bands across Europe and Latin America, of African church bands, of brass and silver bands, community street bands and samba bands, the fanfare bands of the French, and in the US, the activist bands, shout bands and marching bands. There are two main types, percussion bands like samba bands and dole drummers, and then reeds, brass and drum bands, the bands we will be looking at today. Examples of these mixed bands include New Orleans marching bands, Balkan brass bands, French fanfare bands and the wedding bands of Delhi and Nepal. Our own brass and silver band traditions come from this world. We probably started making music outdoors. R. Murray Schafer in the Book of Music and Nature comments, "The other great context for music is the original one, the outdoor environment, and this is the one in which most of the world's music is produced. It is the context of street music, of the outdoor band and orchestra, or of the shepherd with his pipe, or women singing at the village pump. It is inclusive rather than exclusive and tends to be free, not purchased. Above all, it blends with whatever sounds are around." It is free and inclusive. You could take it or leave it, but you should probably dance to it. Street bands have always played an important role in civic and community celebrations and events. Over the centuries, they've served a multitude of functions, from village dances to political demonstrations. William J. Schafer, in Brass Bands and the New Orleans Jazz, talks of the importance of music in 19th century American life. Every village had its silver cornet band and bandstand in the square. Brass bands played for circuses, carnivals, minstrel and medicine shows, political rallies, churches, picnics, dances, athletic contests, holiday gatherings. Music has long been divided between the loud, outdoor, functional music and the soft, indoor music, the music we still call chamber music. Both the ancient Greeks and medieval music had this distinction. Hesiod wrote of a riot of young men reviling with owly playing, some frolicking with dance and song. In England, we danced to bagpipes, shawms and drums. Once every major town and city had civic musicians called waits playing shawms, loud great oboes, and a variety of other instruments for ceremonial occasions, dances and private parties. They also marked the passing of the hours at night, and you could hire them for an early morning wake-up call, or the hunts up. Street music is the sound of festivity, of dancing, of carnival. In Wells in 1607, drummers went out with the May revellers to pick flowers to gather into garlands. Then later they played all night. It is the music of personal ceremony, of weddings and funerals. Like New Orleans, England once had a funeral music tradition where you sang out your faith and fears around the grave. But then outdoor music is also the sound of the military and the state. Our trumpets do sound and our loud cannons roar. People often learnt to play in the military. The militias in the Napoleonic Wars inspired generations of English village bands. In New Orleans, there was a glut of instruments and players after the American Civil War. Out of this came the street bands of New Orleans, one of the key influences in the birth of jazz, and continued to develop their own unique traditions. And, as Rob Boonjah-Laflay says in his book Brass Unbound, when the world outside Europe was blown flat by the winds of colonial conquests, it was the military bands that provided the musical accompaniments. But the instruments of the brass band turned out to be capable of playing more than the marches, psalms and hymns of the new overlords. So street and brass band traditions were often inspired by, but also subverted, colonial models. From Africa to India and in the Pacific, new brass band traditions thrive. Wedding bands in North India and Nepal. In Suriname, kazoo orchestras mimic the shapes and forms of trumpets, tubas, saxophones and trombones. This sound of subversion could be heard in Europe and America too. Street bands have long been the sound of solidarity. Bands accompanied friendly society and union parades, but now new traditions arose. In the 60s, radical theatre companies like Bread and Puppet in the USA and Welfare State International in the UK started to reinvent the street band. They worked with jazz composers like Mike Westbrook and Lowell Coxhill. In Holland, Willem Breuker and Louis Andriessen formed Orkester Volharding. Andriessen wanted to make music that was closest to the people from the street with no affinity to the music that was performed in concert halls. And so, activist and community bands started to make a noise all round Europe. You could hear the Fallout Band at C&D marches in the 80s. In the US too, a whole tradition of radical activist bands started honking at protests and in public places. A tradition now celebrated at Honk Fest. The band gathering started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and now making themselves heard all over the world. And while this was happening, New Orleans reinvented its marching band traditions. The Dirty Dozen Brass Band, the Rebirth Brass Band and the Soul Rebels introduced new energy and rigour to tradition. Now, funky marching bands abound. There are dole and samba bands resounding along our streets, community bands forming, and bands playing at football and cricket matches. And so, this joyful noise continues. After the inhibitions and restrictions of COVID lockdown, when brass and wind instruments were frowned upon, we now need more than ever this music that brings us together, awakens our creativity, and brings a sense of collective joy. This is the first podcast of The Sound of the Streets. We promote and support and create street bands, run education projects, and run the Sound of the Streets Festival, a festival of street bands, outdoor music, and celebratory noise happening in Taunton over the weekend of July the 8th to the 10th. On this soundtrack, you heard the Bollywood Brass Band, the Connecticut Blocko, the Young Pilgrims, Tongues of Fire, the Wadwoes, and the music of Vincent Tourette, all of whom will be appearing at the festival. There will be more podcasts exploring British traditions of celebratory noise and outdoor music, and also street bands around the world. Thank you for listening. The Sound of the Streets also gratefully acknowledges the financial support of Arts Council England in this project. Thank you.